So in Butler's landmark text, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, Butler notes that feminist theory, from the second wave specifically, has traditionally sought representation within the existing language and discourse to extend legitimacy to women as subjects. But the problem she identifies with this approach is that if you're seeking representation and more meaning within the existing discourse, within the pre-existing language as it stands, that discourse has already been constructed and set up by men to work in their favor. You're essentially seeking more space within the rules of a game that have already been laid out by the opposing party. So you're still playing within the rules of that game defined by the competitor, and you're still adhering to the binaries that are laid out by men for women to occupy. And as long as you're still operating within those binaries, such as the gender binary of man and woman, you are still falling into those power relations, specifically a subordinate position within those power relations between male and female, man and woman. If you're still using those terms, then you are subtly legitimizing them still. You're subtly acquiescing to and bowing down to this discursive, binary-laden construction of our experiences of sex and gender, which means you've already lost the game without even playing, because you're already playing on that very unequal playing field, which is set up by someone who doesn't have your strategic interests or your winning interests in mind. It can be a lost cause in that way because those words have already been defined for women by men to ensure that power circulates towards men and away from women. So the Butler reading and the de Beauvoir reading are an interesting conversation with each other, if indirectly. De Beauvoir kind of teases out aspects of this binary nature of our language, and then Butler really hammers down what the problem is with it and how problematic it is for women and women's movements to try to seek representation, more representation for women and the female, while still within that binary of man, woman, male, female. Like we said with de Beauvoir, those binaries are set up so one is in a position of dominance over the other. Just because the subordinate one gets more representation and more things can fall under that category, as long as it's still within that binary, you're playing a game in which you're set up to lose. So Butler argues that the domains of linguistic representation and political representation preemptively set out in advance and it dictate the criteria by which subject positions can already be recognized. So that before representation can be extended to a certain person, the way second wave feminism we're striving for, that person must already have been acknowledged and given meaning as occupying a certain subject position within that discourse. So that merely seeking more representation within that existing male-dominated and heteronormative binary-laden discourse won't any further liberate or empower women because they're still operating within that language of their oppressors, which from the beginning only allows for certain subjects to exist meaningfully within it. So it's one thing to get more representation for women, but what does the term women mean? What does it denote and connote in terms of the meanings and values that are imbued within that term, and who defines it, and on what terms and why, and who gets to occupy it? Like, what if you don't identify as a woman, or at least the traditional conception of a woman that's already discursively constructed for certain people to fit into? Like, how do you represent something that isn't given meaning to begin with? And all of the disjunctive experiences that don't neatly fall into that category of women. What if you're a trans woman or a gay woman? The representation that those second wave feminists were seeking don't necessarily extend to those experiences, those very valid lived experiences. They mostly just extend that already formed subject position of the heterosexual woman. and thus reinforce and repeat and perpetuate and entrench those traditional conceptions of what it means to be a woman, who is allowed to be a woman, and how they are and aren't allowed to fit in, and what actions and behaviors and ways of thinking and ways of communicating are discursively allowed for and consequently disallowed for if you want to perceive yourself as a woman to begin with, to even identify with those writings of second wave feminism. And not just on the basis, on the axis of sexuality, but also on the axis of race. Like we were talking about earlier, second wave feminism was mostly feminism for white women. So merely extending representation for that category doesn't do much for all of the women of color who don't readily fit into that pre-formed category. So to seek more representation within someone else's language is tantamount to breaking out of one cage while still being in a larger cage. So some people may get a bit more freedom and lateral movement, but now you're just within a slightly bigger cage. So it's a superficial emancipation that amounts to a lateral move, side to side rather than forward. You're not getting anywhere meaningful, no pun intended, because you're not producing any new meaning. You're still existing within those old meanings that, again, are defined by men and only really pertain to straight white women. So that a lot of those well-intentioned attempts amount to lip service and provide a false critique where their identified problem that they're trying to resolve and overcome wasn't the problem to begin with. You might be addressing some of the overt symptoms, but not addressing the underlying cause of said symptoms. So the symptoms are going to keep appearing. So that to seek representation for this gender or that gender, as soon as you even use that word gender, you're playing by the rules of your competitor's game. You're unintentionally playing for their team and scoring on your own net by making it seem like progress is being made, but it's symbolic progress for only a certain amount of people. You're implicitly giving in to and surrendering yourself to discourse by using the words, the parole, the speech acts that the langue and the discourse provides for you to use. So you're not only playing by the other team's unfair rules, but you're using their ball that they provided for you, because you're still using the binary laden terms that they provided for you to categorize your own experiences and express your experiences and give a preordained meaning to them. Like, this may seem inconceivable from being within our subject positions and within this discourse, but what if you decide to just not have a gender? Like, I know it just seems inconscionable, but what if you decide to not be identified by your gender, or identify yourself through your gender, or even use or acknowledge or give credence to that term, which again is not natural. It's socially constructed by social actors throughout history that have turned it into a social structure that seems to us as natural reality. So it's like that bowling analogy from the Week on Power, how the gutters are blocked off by buffers, and you're free to move side to side within the bowling lane, you being the ball in this analogy, but you can never go into the gutters. And the gutters is everything existing outside of that gender binary. And you're allowed to roam a little bit and move laterally within that cordoned off section of discourse where you can't just not have a gender. Again, since birth, since you've been given a name, since you've been given a blue blanket as a baby or a pink blanket as a baby or a G.I. Joe or a Barbie doll, you were born into a language that naturalizes these gender categories that operate on a binary. So society constrains us along this binary logic so that we're made to have a gender whether or not we even want to. You can be as radical and transgressive if you want, but as long as you're using the terms and meanings lent to you by the makers of discourse, they don't belong to you. They were made by someone else and then borrowed to you. And when you take them on, when you take on that gender identity, you're taking on the power relations that are inherent to that identity. Like I said with Foucault, your identity are the chains that bind you. And again, even de Beauvoir teased that out a little bit. Remember that relationship between power, knowledge, and truth. Because if you're embarking on an endeavor to achieve and seek more representation for the category of women, representation is the same function through which power uses knowledge to become the truth. So representation isn't neutral. It isn't objective. Things have been, people have been, and experiences have been misrepresented and underrepresented and not represented at all in a lot of cases. And if you're already operating on truths that have been produced by someone else, then any power or knowledge you derive on that basis will be redirected towards them, the shapers of that truth to begin with. Again, it's not an even playing field. Imagine a playing field that's been slanted so that you're constantly having to run uphill and nothing is working in your favor. Because if this traditional method of seeking representation worked, there wouldn't be a third wave and now a fourth wave. It would have ended at the second wave. So that's what necessitated the third wave to create new games and new playing fields and bring our own balls to the field and set our own goalposts and play by rules that we set out instead of ones that have already been set out for us. If you're not entirely sure of what Butler's critique consists of, that's okay. We can go a bit further down the rabbit hole to explore what she sees as faulty in previous attempts at women's liberation and how she seeks to address it and level the playing field. So in this first quote, Butler gives a nice shout out to Foucault in saying that Foucault points out that juridical systems of power, juridical systems meaning legal systems and governmental systems, and just the official representations in discourse, the formal realms of capital P power. These juridical systems of power produce the subjects they subsequently come to represent. Juridical notions of power appear to regulate political life in purely negative terms. So like sovereign power, the right to imprison or the right to take life away. So through limitation, prohibition, regulation, control, and even protection of individuals related to that political structure. But the subjects regulated by such structures are, by virtue of being subjected to them, formed, defined, and reproduced in accordance with the requirements of those structures. So what does that mean? That juridical systems of power produce the subjects they subsequently come to represent. Going back to our discussion of Foucault and the discursive construction of our subjective experiences, we as subjects, that is subjects of a discourse with a bundled subjectivity, don't pre-exist discourse as if we possess some sort of essential natural core that exists before discourse and then enters into discourse as a fully formed, a preformed being. That discourse just simply comes along later and labels us as such, as if this was the reflective approach to representation. Instead, discourse constructs us. It constructs the words and the concepts we use to interpret and give meaning to our experiences and to ourselves and to our identities. Discourse has a concealing function, a naturalizing function that covers up the discursive origins of our subjective being and kind of reassures us that no, you are this naturally preformed thing. We didn't make you that way, you just are that way. So that discourse appears on the surface as neutral, and we appear on the surface as natural. This is why sovereign power worked so well, is because people saw themselves as these autonomous beings, these rational choice actors who are voluntarily giving up their power to the sovereign. But in order for you to even get that point, to make that seemingly conscious rational choice, you need the words to conceive of making that choice and the pre-limited options that discursively preclude other possibilities, so that seems like the only rational, reasonable option. And according to Butler, this plays just as much of a role in those capital P formal realms of legal discourse and government discourse and juridical discourse, the justice system and the penal system. So let me try to make this more concrete, because I understand this is the Butler part has been kind of abstract so far. If a law exists or a legal right exists that only mentions the subjects of man or woman that it applies to, the right to vote is a perfect one, because we started this whole lecture talking about that. There's a time where in that legal discourse, it said man is allowed to vote. And now in present day, it's man or woman is allowed to vote. Or take the rights afforded by government related to married couples and the specific verbiage of who those couples and those rights pertain to and extend to. Historically, it's been man and woman. If that discourse only opens up and allows for those two subject positions, the binary of the man and the woman, then that discourse only allows for those two subject positions of man and woman to possess meaning and to be recognized as meaningful subjects of that discourse. So that anyone who doesn't identify themselves as man or woman, or is identified as man or woman, aren't represented by this arbitrarily defined binary opposition. And for all intents and purposes, they don't exist as a subject with meaning under this law and under this discourse. Sure, they physically exist, just like the tree falling in the forest from the week on semiotics. But remember, everything with meaning exists within discourse, so that if discourse doesn't open up a position, a subject position for you to meaningfully occupy and to give meaning to your experiences, then a notion of truth forms around that knowledge that those rights are only afforded to man and woman, leaving everyone who doesn't identify on either side of that binary of categories to be robbed of meaning. There's no subject position for them to occupy. There's no validity given or meaning given to their subjective experiences, and are thus not subjects of that law. They're not legal subjects who those rights are extended to in the same way as if you occupied one of the subject positions that are allowed for within that discourse, legal discourse in this case. In order for you to get access to that right, you need to step into a position in discourse that's preordained for you to occupy in order to be recognized and to recognize yourself as a subject and a social agent with legal rights and legal protections, the same ones that are afforded to man and woman. So we're not these fully formed cores of being that are then represented by discourse. It is through the representations of discourse that we are constructed in the first place. Our being itself is produced through the representations inherent to a discourse. So all of our subjective experience is discursively conditioned. Anything you experience, you need to give a word to in order to describe it and conceptualize it and make meaning of it and make sense of it. And how else do you do that but by grabbing from and borrowing from the terms that are made available to you by discourse? So let's say you're completely alone looking at yourself in the mirror, as the title of this lecture would indicate. Even in that moment, when there's no one around you, discourse is still playing a role in how you perceive what you see in the mirror in yourself. What you're perceiving in that moment, completely alone and interpreting, is discursively conditioned. That is filtered through discourse before it even enters our conscious minds. So it feels so natural and instantaneous and spontaneous to be looking yourself in the mirror and say, yep, that's that. I have this because I'm that gender, and I have this feature because I'm that gender. But like I said, there's no such thing as like a pre-gendered substance or core called the person. We are gendered through discourse, so that when you look at yourself in the mirror, you are already discursively preconditioned to preconsciously give a certain gendered meaning and interpretation to what you're experiencing when you're looking in the mirror. All those years and decades of your life experiences that shape your subjective experience and interpretation of any given moment, you carry that with you, so that discourse truly is everywhere. Even when you're all alone, you can't escape it. Everything you perceive and interpret is pre-consciously filtered, as if you're wearing a pair of glasses, not in front of your eyes, but like behind your eyes, like in your eye socket. And that pair of glasses literally frames your experiences, so you give it certain meanings. And this pre-consciously limits our possibilities for identifying ourselves. We have to identify ourselves through that lens of one gender or the other. I'm a man, therefore I have this anatomical body part when I'm looking in the mirror, or I have long hair, that's not very manly. Like the fact that the word man is even entering my mind in something as seemingly natural as looking yourself in the mirror shows how thoroughly ingrained gender discourse is to all of our experiences. In that moment, culture is playing a role, discourse is playing a role, representation is playing a role. It doesn't need to be done manually. It happens automatically. The perception of what you're seeing in the mirror is represented by that pre-conscious frame behind your eye sockets that throws that word out there into your mind and attaches it to that experience. There's no natural meaning to the word man or the values and the biases that are instilled in that word and our judgments of our experiences through the lens of that word. But in the moment, we experience it as completely natural. So there are built-in discursive constraints to our subjective experiences, and they're constrained by these binary notions of gender and all sorts of other binaries through which our language and our categorization of experiences is constructed, which thus produces our meaningful experiences and produces us. Because what else are we but this bundle of experiences given meaning? Like I said, discourse always allows for certain things, certain meanings to exist and proliferate, and it disallows other equally valid but pre-consciously excluded ways of categorizing and giving meaning to our conceptions, giving meaning to ourselves, and conceiving our own being, our own sexuality, our own gender, and then not only excludes but precludes other ways of conceiving sexuality and gender, and potentially not even using those words, those terms, or those binaries. Like, why limit ourselves like that into these rigid, predefined categories simply because they haven't been discursively authorized? So once again, this is in conversation with de Beauvoir. I'm not sure if this quote is in de Beauvoir's reading that we assigned this week, but it's probably her most quoted line of "one is not born a woman, but becomes one." There's no natural meaning inherent to that word woman that half the population identifies themselves as. Men and women aren't born, they're made through discourse, through all the discourses that label them and identify as such, so that in order for them to fit into discourse and possess meaning, they have to make themselves into man or woman, thus becoming what discourse sets them out to be through the adoption of certain allowed for subject positions. So that law, those legal rights and protections that we talked about that seem to just neutrally refer to man or woman, all those build up into a discursive formation. They build the categories of men and women that we then step into and form ourselves as such. So, the discourse that claims to represent women is the same discourse that produces them as governable subjects. And the feminist subject turns out to be discursively constituted by the very political system that is supposed to facilitate its emancipation. So second wave feminism was largely seeking liberation and emancipation within the same discourse that constituted them as women in the first place, within that same discourse that discursively conditions their experiences when looking in the mirror or in any other aspect of everyday life, so that they're seeking liberation within the language that's enslaving them and limiting their subjective experiences and their ways of being, so that merely expanding those pre-existing categories still ensure that they're entrapped and entombed and encapsulated within the discursively preordained bounds of meaning making. So the quotes on this slide further delineate Butler's line of thinking regarding the discursive construction of gendered subjectivity. So according to Butler, again, invoking Foucault, the question of the subject is crucial for politics and feminist politics and identity politics because juridical subjects are invariably produced through certain exclusionary practices that do not show once the juridical structure of politics has been established. In other words, the political construction of the subject proceeds with certain legitimating and exclusionary aims. And these political operations are effectively concealed and naturalized by a political analysis that takes juridical structures as their foundation. So it's kind of like a circular argument. It's a circular logic. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy that we discussed earlier a couple weeks ago, where discourse, through its proliferation of knowledge, establishes certain subject positions that are made to feel natural over time. As those layers of knowledge build upon each other and knowledge shapes experience, which shapes knowledge. So that knowledge of me as a man shapes my experience of me seeing myself in the mirror. And I take that experience that's been given meaning as a man and I go out into the world and I continue perpetuating and proliferating that knowledge and then that experience. And then it becomes the truth of the matter. And whose power does this benefit? So this not only legitimizes one way of thinking and speaking and being, but at the same time, again, unconsciously, it's excluding other ways of thinking and speaking and being. And as those layers of knowledge and experience are stacked upon each other, those other alternatives fall to the wayside and are precluded as impossibilities. They used to be possibilities, but they're discursively reconstructed as unnatural impossibilities. So that at some point, at a layer high up, you can't even see them anymore. They've been lost to consciousness and become inconceivable in the most literal and frightening way, precisely because we don't know it. So for Butler, it's not enough to merely ask how women may become more fully represented in language and discourse and politics and all realms of social life, as was the main driving impetus of second wave feminism, but to understand how the category of women, how the term of women, and all the experiences and meanings and values that are bundled and power relations that are all bundled within that category, and most importantly, unequal power relations, how that category of women, the subject of feminism, the subject position opened up by feminist discourse, is produced and restrained by the very structures of power through which emancipation is sought. So I want to reiterate that analogy of a cage within a cage. Second wave feminists were in a very tiny cage. First wave feminists were in an even ridiculously tinier cage. And they managed to break free of that one and get a bit more breathing room, but they're still within multiple more cages because they're still operating within the language and discourse and thus the power relations behind that language and discourse that caged them in the first place. Again, the matrix could be a good analogy here. Like imagine you're in the matrix and within the matrix, you get a bit more power. You become a CEO of a company within, again, the computer simulation of a matrix. You're not outside of the matrix suddenly. The computers that run the matrix are perfectly content with giving you that illusory freedom and that false sense of emancipation because you're still within the matrix. So in order for Butler and other third wave feminists to understand how the category of women is produced and restrained by the various structures of power through which emancipation is sought, she conducts her genealogy of the concept of gender, the category of women. She digs into the archaeology of knowledge that's produced surrounding the experience of being a woman that produced that subject of feminism, while at the same time restraining it in certain ways and excluding potential for action. And how this category over time and through deliberate discursive construction has achieved a status of naturalness and attained stability within discourse and coherence to all those from within that subject position experiencing the world, and from those in the rest of the social world experiencing those in that subject position, has only been naturalized and stabilized and made cohesive only in the context of the heterosexual framing of meaning making. So the term women is already part and parcel of that binary opposition between men and women that presupposes and denotes and connotes, but of course that stabilized binary misrepresents and underrepresents and doesn't represent at all everyone who falls through the cracks and whose subjective experiences are demeaned and robbed of meaning and invalidated and delegitimized and unauthorized subtly by the instantiation and the substantiation of that binary, that discursively constructed binary of typically white heterosexual males and white heterosexual females.